June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. Along a 800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by their Finnish, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allies, prepared to launch the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, the codename for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, was about to begin. Among the thousands of weapon systems being moved into position in the pre-dawn darkness were approximately 900 examples of a relatively new German anti-tank gun, the 5-centimeter Panzerabwehrkanone 38, better known as the Pak-38. German gunners, many of them veterans of the campaigns in Poland, France and the Balkans, had confidence in their new weapon. At 50mm caliber, it was significantly more powerful than the obsolete 37mm Pak-36 that had proven increasingly inadequate against heavier Allied armour. The Pak-38 could penetrate 78mm of armour at 500 metres with standard ammunition, and up to 111mm with the new Panzergranate 40 tungsten core rounds. The German High Command believed this would be more than sufficient to deal with any Soviet tank they might encounter. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The story of the Pak-38's first combat against Soviet armour is not simply a tale of one weapon meeting another on the battlefield. It is the story of German intelligence failure, Soviet industrial achievement, and a technological surprise that would fundamentally alter the course of the war on the Eastern Front. It begins not on June 22, 1941, but 3 years earlier, in the design bureaus of Rheinmetall Borsig in Germany and the Kharkov locomotive factory in Soviet Ukraine. After the Spanish Civil War, which had served as a testing ground for weapons and tactics that would define the Second World War, German military planners recognized a troubling reality. The 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank gun, which had performed adequately in Spain, would not remain effective for long. Tank armour was increasing in thickness, and Germany's potential enemies, particularly France and the Soviet Union, were known to be developing heavier tanks. In 1935, Rheinmetall Borsig began work on a successor weapon. The first attempt, designated Pa-37, featured a 50mm caliber, but suffered from insufficient muzzle velocity. The gun simply couldn't accelerate its projectiles fast enough to achieve the penetration performance the Wehrmacht demanded. Rheinmetall went back to the drawing board. The solution was elegant: increase the barrel length. By extending the barrel to 60 calibers, meaning the barrel was 60 times the bore diameter, or 3,000mm, the designers achieved a muzzle velocity of 823 meters per second with standard armor-piercing ammunition. This represented a quantum leap over the Pak-36's 762 meters per second. The new gun, approved for mass production in 1939 and designated Pak-38, featured several innovative design elements. Unlike most anti-tank guns of the era, which used flat or angled shield plates, the Pak-38 incorporated a distinctive curved shield. This design, while more complex to manufacture, provided better protection for the 5-man crew while presenting a lower profile to enemy fire. The gun weighed approximately 1,000 kilograms in firing position, light enough to be moved by its crew, yet heavy enough to provide a stable firing platform. The split-trail carriage allowed for 65 degrees of traverse, meaning the gun could be swung left or right to track moving targets without having to reposition the entire weapon. Elevation ranged from -8 degrees to +27 degrees, and the gun could achieve a rate of fire of up to 16 rounds per minute with a well-trained crew. Production began in 1940, but the Pak-38 arrived too late to participate in the campaigns in Norway, Belgium, France and the Netherlands. The first guns reached German units in the summer of 1940, after France had already fallen. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, the Wehrmacht gradually replaced the obsolete Pak-36 with the new Pak-38, though production constraints meant that by June 1941, only about 900 Pak-38s were available for Operation Barbarossa. The vast majority of German anti-tank capability still relied on the inadequate 37mm gun. German anti-tank gun crews training with the Pak-38 in early 1941 were impressed with the weapon's capabilities. Test firing against captured French and Polish tanks demonstrated that the gun could defeat any armour thickness likely to be encountered in combat. Intelligence reports on Soviet tank forces, compiled from various sources including aerial reconnaissance, Human intelligence from the Soviet Union and captured documents suggested that the Red Army's armoured forces consisted primarily of light tanks like the T-26 and BT series, with armour ranging from 15 to 30 millimeters. These vehicles would be completely helpless against the Pak-38. There were reports of heavier Soviet tanks, but German intelligence officers dismissed these as exaggerations, or as referring to small numbers of experimental vehicles unlikely to be encountered in significant numbers. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. In reality, by June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union had deployed almost 1,000 T-34 medium tanks and over 500 KV-1 heavy tanks, concentrated in 5 mechanized corps in the western military districts. The Germans had no idea these tanks existed. The T-34, designed by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, represented a revolutionary approach to tank design. It combined 3 characteristics that had previously been considered mutually exclusive: heavy armour, high mobility, and powerful armament. The T-34's hull was protected by 45 millimeters of armour, but unlike conventional tanks where armour plates were mounted vertically or at shallow angles, the T-34's armour was sloped at 60 degrees from vertical. This meant that a projectile striking the front hull had to penetrate not 45 millimeters of steel, but effectively 90 millimeters due to the increased path length through angled armour. The turret mounting a 76.2mm gun was equally well protected. The tank was powered by a V2 diesel engine producing 500 horsepower, giving it a road speed of 55 km per hour and excellent cross-country mobility thanks to the Christie suspension system and wide tracks that distributed the tank's 26-ton weight over a large surface area. If the T-34 was a nasty surprise, the KV-1 heavy tank was a nightmare. Named for Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov, the KV-1 weighed 45 tons and was protected by 75 millimeters of armour on the hull front and 90 millimeters on the turret. It mounted the same 76.2mm gun as the T-34 but in a heavier, more heavily protected platform. The KV-1 was virtually immune to every anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal, except at point-blank range. Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, with a massive artillery barrage followed by ground assaults across the entire front. The initial German advances were spectacular. Caught by surprise despite numerous intelligence warnings, Soviet forces reeled backward. In the first hours and days of the invasion, German panzer divisions raced deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority almost immediately, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground in the war's opening days. For German infantrymen advancing behind the panzer spearheads, the first days of Barbarossa seemed to confirm everything they had been told about Soviet weakness. Thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered, abandoned equipment littered the roads. It appeared the campaign would be over in weeks. Then, on June 23rd, the second day of the invasion, German forces encountered something they had never seen before. Near the Dubisa River in Lithuania, elements of the 6th Panzer Division, part of Army Group North, were advancing toward the city of Kaunas when they encountered a Soviet tank blocking the road. The tank, which German soldiers initially couldn't identify, had already destroyed several trucks and was firing on the advancing column. A Pak-36 crew rushed their gun into position and opened fire. The distinctive crack of the 37mm gun echoed across the battlefield. The gunner, a veteran of the French campaign, watched through his sight as his armour-piercing round struck the Soviet tank squarely on the hull. There was a bright flash of impact, then nothing. The tank didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The Pak-36 crew fired again, and again. They would eventually fire 23 rounds at this single tank. Most struck home, none penetrated. The tank's turret traversed slowly toward them, and the crew abandoned their gun and ran. This was German soldiers' first encounter with the KV-1 heavy tank, and it was a preview of horror to come. Throughout June 23rd and 24th, scattered reports began filtering back to German headquarters of encounters with unknown Soviet tank types that were completely invulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. The reports were initially dismissed as panic or exaggeration. Experienced officers who had fought in Poland and France assured commanders that no tank could withstand concentrated anti-tank fire. They were wrong. On June 24th, near Grodno in Belarus, a Pak-38 crew from the 162nd Infantry Division would have the dubious honour of being among the first German units to engage a T-34 medium tank with the new anti-tank gun. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, the gun commander, was a 24-year-old veteran who had served in Poland and France. His 5-man crew had trained extensively with the Pak-38 and were confident in their weapon. When the call came that Soviet tanks were approaching their position, they moved their gun forward to a covered position behind a low stone wall with a clear field of fire across an open field. The first tank appeared at the tree line about 800 metres away, a squat angular shape that none of the crew recognised. Becker studied it through his binoculars. The hull appeared oddly shaped, with sloping armour unlike the vertical plates common on German and French tanks. The turret was large, mounting what appeared to be a 76mm gun. Becker decided to hold fire until the tank closed to effective range. At 500 metres, he gave the order. The gunner, Gefreiter Ludwig Schroeder, centred the crosshairs on the centre mass of the approaching tank and squeezed the trigger. The Pak-38 roared, its distinctive sharp crack different from the deeper boom of the older Pak-30s. Through the sight, Schroeder saw the tracer element in the base of the armour-piercing round arc toward the target. It struck the T-34 on the front hull with a bright flash of impact. For a fraction of a second, the crew thought they had scored a kill. Then the T-34 kept coming. The distinctive whine of its diesel engine grew louder as it accelerated toward them. Becker ordered another shot. This time Schroeder aimed for the turret. Another hit. Another flash of impact. The tank didn't stop. A third shot. A fourth. Each struck home. The range was now down to 300 metres, well within what should have been certain kill range for the Pak-38. The T-34's turret began to traverse toward them. The Soviet gunner had spotted the muzzle flash from the Pak-38. Schroeder fired again, this time aiming low at the hull where the armour should be thinnest. The round struck, and once again failed to penetrate. The T-34's gun fired. The 76.2mm high-explosive shell passed over the gun crew's heads by less than a metre and exploded behind them, showering them with dirt and debris. Becker's mind raced through his training. At this range, against any tank he had ever encountered, the Pak-38 should be achieving certain penetrations. The math was simple. The gun could penetrate 78mm at 500 metres with standard ammunition. The T-34 was now at 200 metres. At that range, the gun should penetrate at least 85mm. What none of them understood, what German intelligence had failed to discover, was that the T-34's 45mm of armour, sloped at 60 degrees, was effectively equivalent to 90mm of vertical armour against a projectile travelling horizontally. The standard armour-piercing round from the Pak-38 was hitting the sloped hull and simply glancing off. The T-34 fired again. This time the Soviet gunner's aim was true. The high-explosive shell struck the ground 2 metres in front of the Pak-38, throwing up a wall of dirt and stones. Shrapnel peppered the gun shield, and the loader, Gefreiter Otto Richter, screamed as fragments tore into his left arm and shoulder. The T-34 was now at 150 metres and closing fast. Becker made a split-second decision. "Traverse right," he ordered. "Hit the tracks." If they couldn't penetrate the armour, they could at least try to immobilise it. Schroeder swung the gun slightly right and aimed at the T-34's tracks. The shot was perfect. The armour-piercing round struck the track assembly, and the track broke with a metallic snap, audible even over the roar of the diesel engine. The T-34 slewed to the left as one track continued to drive, while the other dragged uselessly. The tank ground to a halt at about 100 metres from the Pak-38 position, but it wasn't dead. The turret continued to traverse, the gun seeking targets. Becker ordered his crew to fall back and manhandle the gun rearward behind better cover. For the next 20 minutes, the immobilised T-34 dominated the battlefield. German infantry trying to advance past it were pinned down by machine gun fire from the tank's hull-mounted and turret-mounted machine guns. The tank's 76mm gun fired at any target that presented itself. German casualties mounted. Finally, an 88mm flak gun was brought forward. This heavy anti-aircraft weapon, with its high muzzle velocity and large caliber projectile, was one of the few German weapons that could reliably defeat heavy armour. From a range of 800 metres, the Flak 88 crew engaged the immobilised T-34. The first shot struck the turret face and penetrated, detonating inside the fighting compartment. The T-34 stopped firing. The crew was dead. Becker and his men examined their gun. They had fired 11 rounds at the T-34. They had achieved at least 7 confirmed hits on the hull and turret. Not one had penetrated. The Pak-38, which just 24 hours earlier had been considered the finest anti-tank gun in the world, had been rendered obsolete by a Soviet tank they didn't even know existed. Similar encounters were occurring all along the front. German after-action reports from late June 1941 tell a consistent story: shock, confusion and desperation, as German troops encountered T-34s and KV-1s that shrugged off fire from every weapon except heavy artillery pieces and the 88mm flak guns. A report from the 17th Panzer Division stated, "Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at the T-34, which sound like a drum roll, but he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster." Lieutenant Stupe, commander of a Panzer III tank armed with a 50mm gun, reported making 5 hits on a T-34 with Panzer Granate 40 tungsten core ammunition at ranges between 20 and 50 meters. None penetrated. A German infantry officer near Minsk recorded in his diary, "Our companies opened fire at about 800 yards, but it remained ineffective. The enemy tanks drove straight through our defensive positions, literally flattening them. We had the impression of being like David against Goliath." It's important to understand that these early encounters with T-34s and KV-1s didn't immediately determine the outcome of Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army's mechanized corps, despite possessing these excellent tanks, were poorly organized, inadequately trained, and critically short of logistical support. Most Soviet tank units went into battle with insufficient fuel, limited ammunition, and no spare parts. Many T-34s and KV-1s were lost not to German fire, but to mechanical breakdowns, fuel starvation, or abandonment when isolated from their supply lines. A report from the Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps shows that on June 22nd, the unit possessed 414 new tanks, including T-34s and KV-1s. By July 12th, only 3 weeks later, just 45 remained, not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they had broken down or been abandoned for lack of fuel or parts. Nevertheless, when these advanced Soviet tanks were properly employed, they had a devastating psychological impact on German troops. The Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe in a series of lightning campaigns, had never encountered an enemy tank they couldn't defeat. The T-34 and KV-1 represented something fundamentally new, armoured vehicles that rendered German anti-tank doctrine obsolete. German anti-tank gun crews began referring to the Pak-36 as the door knocker, because all it could do against a T-34 was knock on the armour without penetrating. Even the newer Pak-38, which should have been adequate, could only defeat T-34s with lucky hits at close range, or by using the rare and expensive Panzer Granate 40 tungsten core ammunition, and even then only at dangerously close ranges of under 300 meters. Against the KV-1, the Pak-38 was almost completely useless. German commanders at the front sent increasingly desperate reports back to headquarters describing the situation. General Heinz Guderian, commander of Panzer Group II, wrote, "The T-34 combined punch with mobility in a single superb package. Our tanks and anti-tank guns are outmatched." By early July 1941, German military intelligence had compiled enough battlefield reports to understand the scale of the problem. They had encountered not just a handful of experimental tanks, but a systematic Soviet tank force built around 2 designs that were superior in virtually every respect to anything in German service. The implications were staggering. On July 3, 1941, just 11 days into Operation Barbarossa, the German High Command convened a special commission to study captured T-34s and develop countermeasures. This was unprecedented. Never before in the history of armoured warfare had an army been forced to fundamentally reconsider its weapons and tactics less than 2 weeks into a campaign. The commission examined several captured T-34s and KV-1s. Their findings were sobering. The T-34's sloped armour, Christie suspension, wide tracks, and powerful diesel engine represented a level of design sophistication that German engineers respected and feared. The report noted that the T-34 combined firepower, armour protection, and mobility far superior to other tanks then in service. Including Germany's own Panzer III and Panzer IV, the KV-1 was described as virtually impregnable to frontal attack, except by the heaviest weapons. The Commission recommended several immediate measures. First, production of the PaK-38 should be accelerated, and all remaining Pe-36 guns should be retired as quickly as possible. Second, development of a more powerful anti-tank gun, the 75mm PaK-40, should be prioritised. Third, supplies of Panzergranit 40 tungsten core ammunition should be increased dramatically. Fourth, all anti-tank gun crews should be trained in new tactics for dealing with heavily armoured Soviet tanks. These tactics emphasise several key principles. First, engagement ranges should be reduced to under 300 metres whenever possible, even though this meant exposing gun crews to greater danger. At closer ranges, even the Pe-38's standard ammunition had a chance of penetrating T-34 armour, particularly if the tank could be hit from the side or rear. Second, gun crews should aim for specific weak points. The T-34's turret ring, where the turret joined the hull, was vulnerable. The driver's vision port was a weak point. The side armour was thinner than the front. The tracks could be targeted to immobilise the tank, after which it could be destroyed at leisure by heavier weapons. Third, anti-tank guns should never be deployed singly, but in groups of at least 3, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. One gun might not stop a T-34, but 3 guns concentrating fire from different angles stood a better chance. Fourth, anti-tank guns should be closely coordinated with other weapons. Engineers with satchel charges or mines, infantry with magnetic hollow charge grenades, and any available artillery should all be integrated into the anti-tank defence. Fifth, the 8mm flak guns, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, should be routinely employed in the anti-tank role. These guns, with their high muzzle velocity and large projectile, could defeat any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. By August 1941, these new tactics were being disseminated throughout the Wehrmacht. PaK-38 crews were receiving intensive training in close-range engagements and learning to identify the weak points on Soviet tanks. The critical importance of these lessons was underscored on numerous occasions throughout the summer and fall of 1941. In one engagement near Smolensk in August, a PaK-38 crew commanded by Feldwebel Erich Hartmann demonstrated how the new tactics could be effective. Hartmann's gun was positioned on the edge of a small forest, providing excellent concealment with a clear field of fire across an open field. When 3 T-34s appeared, advancing in line abreast about 600 metres away, Hartmann held his fire. This required tremendous discipline. Every instinct told him to open fire at maximum range, but he knew from reports that long-range fire was largely ineffective against T-34s. The 3 Soviet tanks continued their advance, apparently unaware of the concealed Pe-38. At 400 metres, Hartmann still waited. At 300 metres, he gave the order to load Panzergranit 40 tungsten core ammunition and aim at the lead tank. At 250 metres, he ordered fire. The PaK-38 cracked, and the tungsten core projectile, travelling at 180 metres per second, struck the lead T-34 on the front hull just below the gun mantlet. At this range, with this ammunition, the projectile had sufficient energy to defeat the sloped armour. It penetrated and the tank immediately caught fire. The crew bailed out. The other 2 T-34s immediately began taking evasive action, one turning left, the other right. Hartmann's gunner tracked the second tank as it tried to turn. As it turned, it briefly exposed its thinner side armour. The gunner fired. Another hit. Another penetration. The second T-34 stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The third T-34, now aware of the threat, turned its turret toward the PaK-38's position and fired. The Soviet gunner's aim was excellent. The 76mm shell struck the ground directly in front of the gun shield, and the explosion killed Hartmann's loader instantly. But the gun itself was undamaged. Hartmann's gunner, despite having just seen his comrade killed, maintained his composure. As the T-34 began to accelerate toward them, attempting to close the range and overwhelm the gun position, the gunner aimed carefully at the tank's right track. The shot severed the track, immobilizing the T-34 at about 150 metres. A second shot aimed carefully at the turret ring, penetrated and disabled the tank. 3 T-34s destroyed for the loss of 1 man killed and 2 wounded. But Hartmann's crew had expended 5 rounds of the precious Panzergranit 40 ammunition. The gun had only 3 rounds of this ammunition left. Engagements like this demonstrated that the PaK-38, when properly employed with the right ammunition and tactics, could defeat T-34s. but it required near-perfect conditions, close range, tungsten core ammunition, well-trained crews, good firing, positions, and often a degree of luck. These conditions were not always present. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1941, as German forces pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, Pak-38 crews continued to face T-34s and KV-1s in combat. Each engagement reinforced the harsh lesson that had been learned in late June. Soviet tank design had leapfrogged German capabilities, and German anti-tank doctrine had to adapt or face defeat. By December 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow stopped the German advance and pushed the Wehrmacht back from the Soviet capital, German military planners understood they faced a fundamental problem. They needed more powerful anti-tank weapons, and they needed them quickly. The PA-40, a 75mm anti-tank gun with significantly better armour penetration, was in development but wouldn't be available in significant numbers until 1942. In the meantime, an interim solution was needed. This led to one of the more interesting improvised weapons of the war, the Pa-97-38. German forces had captured thousands of French 75mm Model 1897 field guns during the fall of France in 1940. These guns, dating from the turn of the century, were obsolete as field artillery, but had relatively powerful 75mm barrels. In an ingenious piece of wartime adaptation, German ordnance officers decided to mate the French gun barrels to the carriage of the Pak-38. The resulting hybrid weapon, designated 7.5cm Pak-97-38, entered service in summer 1942. It was never an ideal solution. The French barrels had relatively low muzzle velocity, meaning their armour-piercing capability was limited. To compensate, the weapon was primarily equipped with heat-shaped charge ammunition, which could defeat heavy armour regardless of velocity. But it provided a stopgap capability until sufficient numbers of the purpose-designed Pak-40 could reach frontline units. The story of the Pak-38's first encounters with Soviet tanks is ultimately a story about the nature of technological warfare and the dangers of intelligence failure. German military intelligence had failed to discover the existence of the T-34 and KV-1, or had dismissed reports about these tanks as exaggerations. This failure had real consequences on the battlefield, measured in German casualties and operational setbacks. The encounters also revealed something about Soviet industrial and design capabilities that German leadership had consistently underestimated. The T-34 was not just a good tank, it was a revolutionary design that combined multiple advanced features in a single package. That the Soviet Union, a nation that German propaganda consistently portrayed as backward and primitive, could produce such a weapon in quantity came as a profound shock to German military and political leadership. Hitler himself, in conversations with his military advisors, reportedly expressed regret that he had authorized the invasion if he had known about Soviet tank strength. He allegedly said, "If I had known about the Russian tank strength in 1941, I would not have attacked." Throughout 1942 and 1943, the evolution of German anti-tank weapons can be directly traced to the lessons learned in those first terrible encounters in June and July 1941. The Pak-40 entered service in large numbers and proved capable of defeating T-34s at reasonable combat ranges. The 88mm flak guns were increasingly employed in dedicated anti-tank roles. New tank designs, including the Panther and Tiger, were specifically developed to counter the T-34 threat. Germany's tank development for the rest of the war was essentially a response to the T-34. For the men of the Pak-38 gun crews who faced T-34s in those early days of Operation Barbarossa, the experience was searing. These were veterans who had fought in Poland and France, men who had seen their weapons destroy enemy tanks with confidence and precision. To suddenly face an enemy tank that their weapon couldn't reliably defeat, to watch armour-piercing rounds strike home without effect, to see their comrades killed by tanks they couldn't stop, was profoundly demoralising. A letter from a German anti-tank gunner written in August 1941 and captured by Soviet forces provides a window into their state of mind. "We have been firing at these new Russian tanks for 3 days. Sometimes we hit them 5, 6, 7 times, and nothing happens. The shells just bounce off. Then their big gun fires and another of our guns is destroyed, more of our comrades dead. We are told new weapons are coming that can defeat these tanks, but when? How many more of us will die before then? This is not the war we trained for. This is not the war we were promised." The Pak-38 would continue to serve throughout the war, and in many roles it remained effective. Against light and medium tanks with conventional armour layouts, against armoured cars and half-tracks, against field fortifications, the Pak-38 was perfectly adequate. But against the T-34 and KV-1, it was, in the words of one German report, only marginally effective under optimal conditions. The first encounters between the Pak-38 and Soviet heavy tanks in June 1941 represented a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, though it would take months for the full implications to become apparent. German forces would continue to advance deep into the Soviet Union throughout 1941 and into 1942, and they would achieve spectacular operational victories, but they would never again possess the overwhelming confidence that had characterized the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. The myth of German invincibility, both in weapons technology and in tactical doctrine, had been shattered by a Soviet tank that German intelligence had failed to anticipate. One of the more remarkable aspects of this story is how quickly German forces adapted to the new reality. Within weeks of the first encounters, new tactics had been developed and disseminated. Within months, new weapons were being rushed into production. The Wehrmacht's ability to analyze battlefield failures and develop practical solutions remained one of its strengths throughout the war. But adaptation could only go so far. The fundamental problem was that the Soviet Union possessed superior tank designs and was producing them in vast quantities. Germany's industrial base, stretched thin by fighting on multiple fronts and by Allied bombing campaigns, struggled to keep pace. The T-34 alone would be produced in numbers exceeding 57,000 by war's end. Germany's most numerous tank, the Panzer IV, totaled about 9,000 units. For the Pak-38, June 22nd and 23rd, 1941, represented both its combat debut and the beginning of its obsolescence. The gun would serve until the war's end, and in skilled hands with good ammunition and favourable tactical conditions, it could still be effective. But it would never be the war-winning weapon that German planners had hoped for. The story serves as a reminder that in war, intelligence about enemy capabilities is as important as the capabilities of one's own weapons. The best tank gun in the world is useless if you don't know what type of armour you'll be facing. The German Pak-38 crews who first engaged Soviet tanks in late June 1941 paid a heavy price for their leadership's intelligence failures. Looking at the specifications, the Pak-38 should have been adequate. Its 78mm of penetration at 500 metres with standard ammunition, or 111mm with tungsten core ammunition, should have been sufficient against most contemporary tanks. The problem was that the T-34 wasn't a contemporary design in the conventional sense. It was a glimpse of the future, combining sloped armour, which effectively doubled its resistance to penetration, with mobility and firepower that wouldn't be matched by German tanks for another year. The encounters also highlighted the importance of crew training and tactics. Early in the war, Soviet tank crews were often poorly trained and tactically unsophisticated. Many T-34s and KV-1s were lost to mechanical breakdowns or poor crew decisions rather than to German fire. As the war progressed and Soviet crews gained experience, they learned to exploit their tanks' advantages, and the T-34 became even more formidable. The psychological impact of these first encounters cannot be overstated. For 2 years, from September 1939 to June 1941, the Wehrmacht had been essentially unstoppable. Every enemy they had faced, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, had been defeated quickly and decisively. German soldiers and officers believed in the superiority of German weapons, German training, and German tactical doctrine. The encounter with the T-34 and KV-1 was the first significant challenge to that belief. German soldiers discovered they could face an enemy whose equipment was superior to their own. This realization, that technological superiority wasn't guaranteed that the enemy might have better weapons, was profoundly unsettling. It's worth noting that the Pak-38 wasn't the only German weapon rendered inadequate by the appearance of Soviet heavy tanks. German tank guns faced similar problems. The 37mm gun on early Panzer III tanks was completely ineffective. Even the 50mm guns on later Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs struggled against T-34s. The short 75mm gun on the Panzer IV, designed for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, was similarly inadequate. Essentially, Germany's entire anti-tank arsenal, from infantry weapons to tank guns to towed anti-tank guns, had been rendered partially obsolete overnight. The urgent need to counter the T-34 and KV-1 drove German weapons development for the remainder of the war. Every subsequent German tank, from the improved Panzer IV to the Panther and Tiger, was designed with the T-34 threat in mind. Every new anti-tank gun, from the Pak-40 to the massive Pak-43, was developed to ensure German forces would never again face an enemy tank they couldn't defeat. For the men who crewed the Pak-38 in those early days of Barbarossa, survival often came down to luck, skill, and an intimate knowledge of their weapons' capabilities and limitations. They learned to wait for the perfect shot, to aim for weak points, to coordinate fire with other weapons. They learned that sometimes the best option was to immobilize a tank by destroying its tracks, then call for heavier weapons to finish it off. They learned that a well-placed 88mm flak gun was worth more than a dozen Pak-38s when facing heavy Soviet armor. These lessons, purchased with blood, became part of the institutional knowledge of the Wehrmacht's anti-tank arm. By 1942, German anti-tank doctrine had evolved significantly from the confident playbook of 1941. The naive assumption that any German anti-tank gun could defeat any enemy tank had been replaced with a more sophisticated understanding of matching weapons to threats, of using combined arms tactics, and of the critical importance of intelligence about enemy capabilities. The Pak-38's story in the opening days of Operation Barbarossa is ultimately a story about the fog of war, about what happens when assumptions meet reality, about the deadly consequences of intelligence failure. It's a story about brave men facing an enemy they were unprepared for, with weapons that proved inadequate, and somehow adapting and surviving. It's a story that reminds us that in war, technological surprise can be as important as numbers or tactics. June 22, 1941, was supposed to be the beginning of a quick campaign to destroy the Soviet Union. For many German soldiers, including the anti-tank gun crews with their new Pak-38s, it was the beginning of a 4-year nightmare that would end in Berlin's ruins. Those first encounters with T-34s and KV-1s, when German shells bounced harmlessly off Soviet armor while Soviet guns destroyed. German positions with impunity were an omen of what was to come. The Pa-38, a fine weapon by the standards of 1939 or 1940, had been rendered marginal by a Soviet design that represented the future of armoured warfare. In the end, industrial capacity and design innovation would prove more important than tactical brilliance or battlefield courage. The German Pak-38 gunners learned this lesson in the most direct and terrible way possible. In combat, watching their rounds fail to penetrate, watching their comrades die, knowing their weapon was inadequate but having no choice except to fight on with what they had. That is the real story of the Pak-38's first encounter with Soviet tanks, not a tale of German technical superiority, but a hard lesson in the limitations of even the best weapons when faced with an enemy who has made an unexpected technological leap forward. The summer of 1941 ground on with brutal intensity, and for German anti-tank crews, each day brought new lessons in survival and new encounters that defied their pre-war training. By mid-July, the initial shock of encountering T-34s and KV-1s had given way to a grim determination to find ways to kill these seemingly invincible machines. The Soviet tank force, despite its technological superiority in individual vehicles, was being systematically destroyed, but not by German anti-tank guns. The primary causes of Soviet tank losses in the summer of 1941 were mechanical breakdown, fuel starvation, poor crew training, and catastrophic operational planning. A typical scenario would unfold something like this. A Soviet mechanized corps, equipped with dozens or even hundreds of T-34s and KV-1s, would receive orders to counterattack German forces that had broken through the front line. The tanks would set out, often without adequate reconnaissance, without air support, and critically, without sufficient fuel trucks or recovery vehicles. They would drive 50 or 100 kilometers to reach the battle area, and during this approach march, 20 or 30% of the force would break down. The T-34 and KV-1, despite their revolutionary designs, were mechanically unreliable, particularly in the hands of poorly trained crews. The engines required careful maintenance. The transmissions were notoriously difficult to operate, and inexperienced drivers would strip gears or burn out clutches. The tracks would break, and without recovery vehicles, a tank with a broken track was effectively lost. Those tanks that reached the battlefield would attack, often with great courage but little tactical sophistication. Soviet tank doctrine in 1941 emphasized mass and aggression over maneuver and combined arms coordination. Tanks would charge German positions in waves, and while their armour protected them from most German weapons, they would be picked off by the few weapons that could hurt them. The 88mm flak guns, firing from concealed positions at ranges of 1,000 metres or more, would destroy T-34s and KV-1s, before the Soviet tanks could even identify the threat. German tanks, particularly the Panzer IV with its short 75mm gun-firing high-explosive shells, couldn't penetrate T-34 armour frontally, but could track them, immobilise them, and then German infantry would close in with satchel charges or telemines to finish them off. The Luftwaffe, which had achieved almost complete air superiority in the first weeks of the campaign, would attack Soviet tank columns with dive bombers armed with 500-kilogram bombs or anti-tank cluster munitions. A near miss from a 500-kilogram bomb could break a tank's tracks or damage its suspension. A direct hit would destroy any tank regardless of armour thickness. After the battle, the Soviet tanks that survived combat would attempt to withdraw, and this is when fuel shortages would become critical. A T-34 consumed approximately 280 litres of diesel fuel per 100 kilometres on roads, much more cross-country. Many Soviet tank units went into battle with only enough fuel for a one-way trip, expecting to refuel from depots that had already been overrun by German forces or destroyed by Luftwaffe bombing. Tanks that ran out of fuel were abandoned. Crews would drain the remaining fuel, destroy the gun breech with a hand grenade if they had time, and march back to Soviet lines on foot. By August 1941, the Soviet mechanized corps that had gone into battle in June with thousands of tanks had effectively ceased to exist as fighting formations. But new Soviet tank units were forming in the rear, equipped with new production T-34s and KV-1s streaming from factories in Leningrad, Moscow and Kharkov, and later from factories evacuated to the Urals. The technological advantage the Soviets possessed in tank design was not a temporary fluke, but a systematic capability that would only grow stronger as Soviet industry mobilized for total war. For German Pak-38 crews, the late summer and autumn of 1941 brought a refinement of tactics and a growing understanding of exactly what their weapon could and could not do. Field testing of captured T-34s by German ordnance units provided detailed information about armour thickness and vulnerable points. This information was compiled into recognition guides and tactical manuals that were distributed to frontline units. The guides identified several specific weak points on the T-34 that Pak-38 crews were trained to target. The turret ring, where the turret joined the hull, was protected by only 45mm of vertical armour. A hit here could jam the turret or penetrate into the fighting compartment. The driver's vision port on the front hull was a structural weak point. The armour around the port was thinner, and a precise hit could penetrate. The rear hull armour was only 40mm thick and vertical, making it vulnerable to Pak-38 fire at ranges out to 500 metres. The side hull armour, at 45mm, was significantly more vulnerable than the front. A side shot at under 400 metres with standard ammunition, or 600 metres with tungsten core ammunition, had a good chance of penetration. The tracks and drive sprockets could be targeted to immobilise the tank, after which it could be destroyed by other means. These weak points required precision shooting under combat conditions, against a moving target that was shooting back, often through smoke and dust, frequently at ranges where the T-34's 76mm gun was devastatingly effective. It required nerve and skill that not all crews possessed. One engagement that illustrates both the potential and the limitations of the Pak-38 occurred in September 1941 near Kiev. A Pak-38 crew commanded by Wachtmeister Karl Fischer was positioned in a defensive line covering the approaches to a river crossing. Fischer's gun was one of 3 Pak-38s positioned in mutually supporting positions along a low ridge overlooking an open valley. Intelligence had warned that Soviet forces were massing for a counterattack to relieve their forces encircled in Kiev, and tanks were expected. The attack came at dawn. Through the morning mist, Fischer's crew spotted movement at the far end of the valley, approximately 200 metres away. As the mist burned off, the shapes resolved into Soviet tanks, at least a dozen of them, including what appeared to be 5 T-34s and several lighter T-26 tanks. The Soviet force advanced in line abreast across the valley floor, infantry following behind the tanks. Fisher held his fire, knowing that at this range his gun was ineffective against T-34s. The other two Pak-38s remained silent as well, waiting. At 600 metres, one of the T-26 light tanks, with only 30mm of armour, separated slightly from the formation, moving toward the German right flank. Fisher's wingman, another Pak-38 positioned 50 metres to his right, engaged this target. The crack of the gun was followed instantly by the sharp clang of a penetrating hit. The T-26 stopped, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out and ran. The remaining Soviet tanks immediately began taking evasive action, weaving and accelerating. The infantry hit the ground. The element of surprise was gone. At 500 metres, Fisher ordered his gunner to engage the lead T-34. The shot was perfect, striking the tank squarely on the front hull. There was a bright flash of impact, but the T-34 kept coming. Fisher's loader rammed another round into the breech and the gunner fired again. Another hit, this time on the turret. Still the T-34 advanced. The range was now 400 metres. The T-34's turret traversed toward Fisher's position. Fisher knew what was coming. The Soviet gunner had spotted his muzzle flash. He ordered his crew to brace for impact. The T-34 fired and the world exploded. The Soviet gunner's aim was slightly high. The 76mm shell passed over the gun shield by less than half a metre and exploded behind the position, showering the crew with dirt and debris. Fisher's ears rang, but the gun was undamaged. At 350 metres, Fisher ordered his gunner to aim for the T-34's tracks. The shot was good, striking the left track and severing it. The T-34 slewed to a stop, one track spinning uselessly, while the other lay on the ground like a dead snake. But the turret remained functional, and the gun was still a deadly threat. The immobilised T-34 continued to fire, engaging targets across the German defensive line. Meanwhile, the other T-34s continued their advance. At 300 metres, Fisher's gunner engaged a second T-34 that had turned slightly, presenting its side armour. The tungsten core round struck the side hull and penetrated. The T-34 immediately began to burn, thick black smoke pouring from the hatches. The crew did not escape. Two more T-34s were destroyed by the other Pak-38s in Fisher's platoon, both at ranges under 300 metres, both with side shots. But two T-34s broke through the defensive line, overrunning German infantry positions and destroying several machine gun nests before German engineers, armed with telemines, managed to immobilise them. When the engagement ended, 5 T-34s had been destroyed or disabled, along with 3 T-26 light tanks. The German defensive line had held, but at a cost. One Pak-38 had been destroyed by a direct hit from a T-34's gun, killing 3 crew members. Infantry losses were heavy, 16 dead and over 30 wounded in the sector. Fisher's gun crew had fired 18 rounds during the engagement. They had achieved 7 confirmed hits on T-34s, but only 2 penetrations, both from side shots at under 300 metres. The immobilised T-34 in front of their position, still burning from the track hit, had required a further 3 rounds aimed at the turret ring before one finally penetrated and silenced the gun. This was the reality of Pak-38 operations against T-34s in 1941. With skill, good positioning, favourable engagement geometry, and a certain amount of luck, the gun could kill T-34s, but it required multiple hits, close range, and often the expenditure of precious tungsten core ammunition. Against lighter Soviet tanks like the T-26, BT-5 and BT-7, the Pak-38 was devastatingly effective at normal combat ranges. But these older designs were being phased out, and increasingly, German anti-tank crews faced T-34s and KV-1s. The true horror weapon for German anti-tank gunners in 1941 was not the T-34 but the KV-1 heavy tank. If the T-34 was difficult to kill, the KV-1 was nearly impossible. The KV-1's 75mm of frontal hull armour and 90mm of turret armour made it effectively immune to Pak-38 fire from any angle except extreme close-range shots into the rear hull. Even with tungsten core ammunition at 100 metres, a frontal penetration of a KV-1 was unlikely. The only reliable method of killing a KV-1 with a Pak-38 was to immobilise it by destroying its tracks, then call for an 88mm flak gun or heavy artillery to destroy it. This process could take hours, during which the immobilised KV-1 would continue to fire its 76mm gun at any target within range. One particularly infamous engagement occurred near Leningrad in August 1941, where a single KV-1 held up the advance of an entire German division for 24 hours. The tank, commanded by Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov, was positioned in a concealed ambush position covering the road to Leningrad. When a column of German vehicles appeared, including tanks, trucks and towed artillery, Kolobanov's KV-1 opened fire at a range of 800 meters. The engagement lasted for over an hour. The KV-1 systematically destroyed 22 German vehicles, including several Panzer III and Panzer T4 tanks, before German forces could organize a response. Multiple Pak-38 crews attempted to engage the KV-1, but their rounds simply bounced off its armour. German tanks tried to flank the position, but the KV-1's thick side armour defeated their guns as well. Eventually, German forces brought up an 88mm flak gun and a 105mm howitzer. After expending over 40 rounds between them, they finally achieved mobility kill on the KV-1, destroying its tracks. But even immobilized, the tank continued to fight. German infantry attempting to approach the tank were driven back by machine gun fire. It wasn't until the tank ran out of ammunition, after firing all 114 of its 76mm shells and over 3,000 machine gun rounds, that Kolobanov and his crew abandoned the vehicle and withdrew to Soviet lines. Engagements like this, while exceptional in their scale, were not unique in kind. Throughout the summer and fall of 1941, German forces encountered KV-1s that absorbed incredible amounts of punishment and continued fighting. One German after-action report from October 1941 describes a KV-1 that was hit 70 times by various anti-tank weapons, including multiple hits from Pak-38s, before finally being disabled by a shot from an 88mm gun. For Pak-38 crews, the tactical doctrine that evolved was simple. Against T-26, BT, and other light Soviet tanks, engage at maximum effective range, typically 500 to 800 meters. Against T-34s, hold fire until 300 meters or less unless a side or rear shot presents itself. Aim for weak points. Coordinate fire with other weapons. Against KV-1s, attempt to immobilize by targeting tracks, then immediately call for heavier weapons. Do not attempt frontal engagement unless no other option exists. This doctrine was sound in theory, but often difficult to execute in practice. Combat is chaotic, visibility is limited, ranges are hard to judge accurately, and tanks don't obligingly present their vulnerable sides to enemy fire. Pak-38 crews frequently found themselves in situations where they had to engage T-34s or KV-1s under unfavourable conditions because the alternative was to let the enemy tanks overrun German infantry positions. As autumn turned to winter in 1941, German anti-tank crews faced new challenges. The first significant supplies of the new Pak-40, a 75mm anti-tank gun with much better armour penetration, began reaching frontline units in December 1941, but in small numbers. The vast majority of German anti-tank capability still relied on the Pak-38 and the obsolete Pak-36. The brutal Russian winter created new problems. Gun mechanisms froze if not properly maintained. Recoil systems seized up in sub-zero temperatures. Crews had to keep fires burning near their guns to prevent mechanical failure, but fires gave away positions to Soviet artillery observers. Tungsten core ammunition, which performed well in normal temperatures, became brittle in extreme cold and sometimes shattered on impact rather than penetrating. The ground froze solid, making it extremely difficult to dig in anti-tank guns properly. Gun crews had to use explosives to blast gun pits in the frozen earth, a time-consuming and dangerous process that often gave away their positions. Soviet tank tactics also evolved as the war progressed. By late 1941, Soviet commanders had learned painful lessons about sending tanks forward, without infantry support, without artillery preparation, and without reconnaissance. Soviet attacks became more sophisticated, with tanks advancing behind rolling artillery barrages, supported by infantry in white winter camouflage, making use of terrain and weather to close the range before German anti-tank guns could engage effectively. The winter battles of 1941 and 1942 saw German forces pushed back from Moscow and forced onto the defensive across much of the front. In defensive operations, the Pak-38 was more effective than in mobile warfare. Gun crews could prepare positions carefully, clear fields of fire, pre-position ammunition, and coordinate with other defensive weapons. But even in defense, The appearance of T-34s or KV-1s could break a defensive line if German forces lacked 88mm guns or heavy artillery in support. One defensive engagement in January 1942 illustrates the desperation that could result when Pat-38 crews faced heavy Soviet armour without adequate support weapons. A German infantry company holding a village near Rzhev came under attack by Soviet forces, including at least 6 T-34s. The company's anti-tank support consisted of 2 Pak-38s and a handful of infantry armed with magnetic anti-tank mines and satchel charges. As the T-34s approached through heavy snow, the 2 Pak-38s opened fire at approximately 400 metres. In the swirling snow and limited visibility, scoring hits was difficult. The guns fired a total of 23 rounds and achieved perhaps 6 hits, none of which penetrated. The T-34s continued their advance, firing high explosive shells and machine guns at German positions. The company commander, a veteran captain named Ernst Bauer, made a desperate decision. He organised a close assault team of 12 volunteers armed with magnetic mines and explosive charges. These men would have to close to within meters of the tanks to attach their weapons, effectively suicide mission in the face of tank machine guns. But with the Pak-38s proving ineffective and no other anti-tank weapons available, it was the only option to prevent the tanks from overrunning the entire position. In the chaos of close combat, in blowing snow that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters, the assault team moved forward. 3 men were killed by machine gun fire before reaching the tanks. 2 more were killed by Soviet infantry supporting the attack. But 7 men reached the T-34s and attached their charges. 4 T-34s were disabled or destroyed by the close assault. The other 2 tanks, apparently unnerved by the ferocity of the defence, withdrew. The German company held its position, but at terrible cost. Of the 12 men in the close assault team, only 4 survived unwounded. Total company casualties were 31 dead and 47 wounded out of an initial strength of 140 men. The 2 Pak-38s had fired nearly all their available ammunition without achieving a single killing hit on a T-34. This was the grim arithmetic of anti-tank warfare on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 and 1942. German infantry, even when equipped with anti-tank guns that should have been adequate, were often forced to engage Soviet heavy tanks at close range with improvised weapons and raw courage because their anti-tank guns simply couldn't penetrate Soviet armour reliably. By spring 1942, the German army's anti-tank situation was beginning to improve. The Pak-40 was entering service in significant numbers, and this 75mm gun could defeat T-34 armour reliably at normal combat ranges. New tank designs were in development that would match or exceed Soviet capabilities. Improved anti-tank rounds for existing weapons were being distributed. But for the men who had fought through the summer and fall of 1941 and the terrible winter that followed, these improvements came too late. They had faced the T-34 and KV-1 with weapons that were marginally effective at best, and they had paid a heavy price. The Pak-38 would continue to serve throughout the war in various roles. It remained effective against lighter armoured vehicles, against fortifications, and in infantry support roles. In secondary theatres like North Africa and Italy, where German forces faced British and American tanks that were generally less heavily armoured than Soviet designs, the Pa-38 performed adequately. But on the Eastern Front against the T-34 and KV-1, the gun that had seemed so powerful in 1940 was revealed as insufficient. This insufficiency was not due to any fundamental flaw in the Pa-38's design. By the standards of 1939 or 1940, it was an excellent weapon. The problem was that the standards had changed, and the change had come not from German innovation but from Soviet design genius. The T-34 and KV-1 represented a paradigm shift in tank design, and the Pa-38 had been designed for a previous paradigm. The long-term consequences of the encounters between Pa-38s and Soviet heavy tanks in 1941 extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. These encounters forced a fundamental reassessment of German armoured warfare doctrine, weapons development priorities, and industrial planning. The Nazi leadership, particularly Hitler himself, became obsessed with matching Soviet tank production both in quantity and quality. This obsession would drive the development of the Panther and Tiger tanks, magnificent machines that were also incredibly complex and expensive to produce. Germany's industrial capacity, stretched thin by the demands of multi-front warfare and increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing, could never produce these complex tanks in the quantities needed. The Soviet Union, with its factories evacuated beyond the Urals out of reach of German bombers, would ultimately produce over 80,000 tanks during the war, many of them T-34s. Germany would produce approximately 25,000 tanks and assault guns of all types. The arithmetic of attrition favoured the Soviets. German anti-tank doctrine also underwent fundamental revision. The pre-war assumption that infantry anti-tank guns could deal with enemy armour gave way to a more complex understanding that required layered anti-tank defences, integration of anti-tank guns with tanks, self-propelled guns, and artillery, and the concentration of anti-tank firepower at critical points rather than even distribution across the front. By 1943 and 1944, German defensive doctrine on the Eastern Front emphasised anti-tank strongpoints. Heavily fortified positions equipped with multiple anti-tank guns of different calibers, minefields and infantry with close assault weapons, all coordinated to channel Soviet tank attacks into killing zones, where concentrated fire could overwhelm even heavy armour. These tactics were effective when properly executed, but they required resources and time to implement. In fluid mobile warfare or when surprised by Soviet offensives, German forces often lacked the time to establish proper anti-tank defences and suffered accordingly. The Pak-38 service record is ultimately mixed. Against lighter armoured opponents, it was highly effective. Over 9,500 Pak-38s were produced during the war, making it one of Germany's most numerous anti-tank guns. It served on every front where German forces fought. Gun crews who mastered the weapon's characteristics and understood its limitations could achieve impressive results even against T-34s under the right circumstances. But the gun will forever be associated with that desperate summer of 1941 when German anti-tank crews discovered their weapons were inadequate against Soviet armour, when highly trained gunners watched in horror as their rounds bounced harmlessly off T-34s and KV-1s, when tactical excellence and battlefield courage proved insufficient in the face of technological inferiority. For the individual soldiers who crewed these guns, who fought and died behind the distinctive curved shields of the Pak-38, the experience of facing T-34s and KV-1s was defining. Many survived and went on to serve with more powerful weapons, others did not. Their story is part of the larger story of the Eastern Front, a story of brutal combat, technological innovation, and the ultimate triumph of Soviet industrial might and numerical superiority over German tactical skill and initial technological advantages. The first encounters between German Pak-38 anti-tank guns and Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in June 1941 were a preview of what was to come, a 4-year struggle that would consume millions of lives and determine the fate of nations. In those early encounters, German confidence met Soviet innovation, and the result shattered assumptions that had guided German military planning for years. The Pak-38, a weapon that should have been adequate, proved marginal. The T-34, a tank that German intelligence had failed to anticipate, proved revolutionary. Between these two truths lay the experiences of thousands of young men on both sides, fighting with the weapons their nations had provided, doing their duty as they understood it, in a war whose scale and brutality exceeded anything in human history. The story of the Pak-38's first combat against Soviet tanks is ultimately a human story about soldiers facing unexpected challenges, adapting to new realities, and fighting with inadequate tools against a formidable enemy. It is a story worth remembering, not for glory or heroism, though both were present, but as a reminder of what happens when intelligence fails, when technological development takes unexpected leaps, and when brave men are asked to fight with weapons that are simply not good enough for the task at hand.